All right, we're glad to have another NRB live at lunch here. Glad you've joined NRB from wherever you are. I'm hosting this live from Nashville, and we're honored to have my good friend Joel Rosenberg from Jerusalem, and I'll introduce Joel in a little bit, but I just want to give it a little bit of time for folks to come on and join. We're glad all of you who have signed up for this. Pretty excited. There's a lot to talk about. So I want to introduce Joel a little bit. I don't think Joel Rosenberg needs much of an introduction. He's best-selling author of several novels and nonfiction. Also does incredible work in the Middle East with both Jewish and Palestinian people, and has been kind of a statesman of sorts over there and over here in the United States as well. We're excited because we announced this week that Joel Rosenberg is going to be at the NRB convention, June 21st through the 25th. And not only is he going to be there, he's also going to be sitting down in a special conversation with former CIA director and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And so if you have not registered for the NRB convention, you'll want to do that. nrbconvention.org. You can register now, and it's still a good time to get a good price on a hotel at the Gaylord Texan there. The convention will be in Texas at the Gaylord, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're very excited about this, and we feel like this is a good time for us to, as vaccinations, COVID vaccinations rise, and the cases are starting to drop, particularly in Texas. If you paid attention to Texas, the cases there have dropped significantly in the last 3 to 4 weeks, and most things are open there. So we're very excited that by the end of June, we'll be able to have a really good, robust convention, get to network and do the things that we do at NRB to encourage and equip and advocate. So make plans to be in Texas with us June 21st to the 25th. Okay, I want to welcome again Joel Rosenberg here to NRB Live at Lunch. Joel, thank you for joining me today, live from Jerusalem.
Well, it's great to be with you, Dan. I'm so honored to be with you, and a shalom and a salam and hello from Jerusalem.
Well, there's so many things we can discuss. In fact, when I was thinking about this webinar, I was just, this is a perfect time to have you on because there's a lot going on in the Middle East and in Israel particularly. So I think I want to start at the top with the most recent kind of developments and news. Israel has had an election, and they're kind of sorting that out, forming a government. For people who are not really familiar with the way that the Israeli elections work, and forming governments, and why, it seems like there's always a new election. Can you explain that a little bit for those of us who are not as nuanced and know as much about how that works?
I'd be happy to, although it's one of the funny things that, so I've been a citizen of Israel now for 7 years. My wife and kids and I, we moved here from the Washington, D.C. area where we lived for almost 24 years. And we made aliyah, that's the term of becoming dual U.S. Israeli citizens. And we've been here, we've had our citizenship 7 years, and we moved in August of 2014. So we're almost here 7 years. We voted 5 times. Okay, and these are all national elections, okay? But there's been 4 elections just in the last 2 years. Now, that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not the way it is historically. And just by contrast, I was having lunch with a Palestinian friend of mine just before COVID really shut everything down. This was about a year ago. And I just was curious, how many times have you voted in your life? He's in his 70s, 1 time. Okay. Now they've got elections coming up this year, but so to have voted 5 times and only be a citizen for 7 years is pretty crazy. But we do like to say here in Israel that we have the only real and certainly robust democracy in the Middle East, but this is getting a little crazy. What's happening? So it's a parliamentary system, obviously not an American system, but the situation is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in the history of the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. Okay, we're not talking about the kings of biblical times. We're talking about the last 70 plus years. So he's the longest serving prime minister. So And if you think about it, what has he accomplished in the last several years? Well, he persuaded President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as our capital. He persuaded Donald Trump to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He persuaded President Trump to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He negotiated with President Trump's help 4 Arab-Israeli peace treaties, what became known as the Abraham Accords, with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Sudan, and with the Kingdom of Morocco. Now, no other Israeli prime minister had ever done more than 1. Netanyahu's done 4. Now, if you just take that plus Netanyahu was the one that ordered our secret services, our CIA, known as the Mossad, to steal the entire nuclear weapons archive of the Iranian government from inside Tehran. He did. We accomplished that. So if you just look at that, you'd say, how come this guy isn't winning in a landslide the last 4 times? And the short version, and it's something we've been reporting, we've got the new site, we'll talk about it soon, these 2 new websites that we launched last September called All Israel News, All Arab News, in order to track what is going on so that evangelicals around the world, certainly North America, that love Israel, but also are curious about peace and about the risk of Iran and all the other issues going on in the Middle East. Where can you go for credible, serious coverage from an evangelical vision or standpoint? All Israel News, All Arab News. And we're covering this. So the short version is that Netanyahu, even though you would think longest serving prime minister and huge accomplishments, but Israelis are getting tired of him, and he handled the COVID crisis very, very badly, costing the country a lot of money. I mean, other countries similar sizes have had far fewer deaths. We've had 6,200 plus deaths. Now, compared to America, I realize it doesn't seem that many. But if you look at it in terms of our population, more Israelis have died this year from COVID this past 12 months than all of our wars and the acts of terrorism against us for the last 25 years. That's how serious it's been here. Now, Netanyahu's done well with the vaccine. Almost 90% of Israelis who want the vaccine and are eligible for it have at least gotten 1 shot, and 60% or so have gotten both, myself included, my family. So but Netanyahu, people are mad at him because of unemployment, because of the economy, because of COVID, because he's also currently on trial this week in 3 separate corruption cases. And there are some other inside baseball stories going on here, but he can't put together a stable governing coalition. And so he keeps taking the country back to a new election, hoping this time to convince everybody. And yet again, he hasn't done it. So we may be going to a 5th round of elections. We'll see. That's the short version, Dan. I know when you start off with a question like that, it's very hard to give a simple answer, but that's the short version.
Yeah, it seems like here in the United States, it's always election season. In Israel, it must really seem like that. I wanted to mention a couple.
And I will say that also, because you guys represent evangelicals all over the world, not just North America, but Netanyahu is almost the only leader in Israel that most Americans, most evangelicals have ever heard of, because he's been around forever. He's very well trusted and loved, actually, by many evangelicals. So it's going to be a shock if he doesn't put together a government eventually, because I wrote a piece in Newsweek about 2 weeks ago. Are we about to enter the post-Netanyahu era? And that's why All Israel News is trying to not only cover the day-to-day, but also who are the players that could emerge as the next prime minister. Most people have never heard of these folks.
I wanted to follow up with that a little bit. You mentioned a couple of things, resources that I want to make people aware of. All Israel News and All Arab News are really great news outlets that Joel and his team have founded and update quite frequently. And so I know many of our members, I read them because I really care about what's going on over there, and many of you do too, but many of you also are working in Christian media and you'd like to have more information about what's going on in the Middle East. These are great sources for you, and you can even quote them and use them, on your websites and things like that. So I really want to make those people aware of that. Joel, we mentioned at the top, but we announced this week that you are going to be interviewing Secretary Pompeo, so former CIA director and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, live at NRB in Texas on June 21st to the 25th. Can you talk a little bit about why you're excited about that opportunity? And then I'd like you to follow that up with just maybe explaining the significance of some of the things Secretary Pompeo was able to accomplish, specifically with the Abraham Accords.
Absolutely, Dan. And I want to thank you and, of course, the NRB CEO, Troy Miller, for inviting me. Originally, you guys had reached out simply because I'm a friend of Mike Pompeo's, going back back to his days in Congress. He had been reading my novels, and one of his assistants once sent me a text saying, "Hey, if you're ever on on Capitol Hill, my boss would love to meet you and just chat and get to know each other." Who knew that he was going to end up becoming the I think the 75th or 70th Secretary of State and CIA director. So you guys had just asked originally, could I reach out to him and see if he'd be interested in speaking? And I'm very happy that he said yes. But when you guys all came back to say, "Hey, would you like to interview him?" Wow, that's special. Look, Mike Pompeo is proved to be one of the most consequential secretaries of state in the last, in the modern era, last 100 years. I mean, certainly Jim Baker and James Baker and others, but think of what was accomplished. Again, the things I just mentioned about Netanyahu. Well, who was the point person on the Trump side? Yes, there was the White House peace team, Jared Kushner and David Friedman, who was the ambassador here in Israel, and Avi Berkowitz and Jason Greenblatt. But heading up the State Department, and one of the key guys, Mike Pompeo, and also Pompeo has even done more on the maximum pressure campaign against the radical forces that are leading Iran than Pompeo spent on his day-to-day portfolio on the peace process here. But two things are happening at the same time. We're seeing dramatic, game-changing peace deals between Israel and the Arab world. Again, we haven't had a single peace treaty in 25 years. The last one was with the Kingdom of Jordan in 1994. Okay, that's 27 years ago. And before that was 1979 with Egypt. And we've gone all that time without any, and now we have 4 new ones, and I believe there's several others in the pipeline. So that dynamic is fascinating, and Pompeo was at the center of that. But even more, because of his CIA work and also just his part of his portfolio, was driving and building an international coalition to isolate the Iranian regime, to pull out of the JCPOA, the very clunky word, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal that President Trump and his team, myself included, felt was really dangerous. It was not what it was really marketed to be. It wasn't creating peace. It wasn't helping Iran get on the on-ramp back onto the world stage as peaceful players. No, it was giving them $150 billion to keep financing their slavery of the people of Lebanon through a terror organization known as Hezbollah, the Houthi terrorist organization that's firing missiles into Saudi Arabia every couple of days. Pompeo was at the center of all of that, not to mention pressuring China on human rights, on their horrible ways that they're ripping off the American consumer. And then North Korea with Kim Jong. I mean, how many people do you know who've met the great leader of, as it were, put in quotes, of North Korea? Pompeo was Trump's point man for that. So he's an enormously consequential player, and he happens to be a personal friend, and he's a devout evangelical Christian who used to teach 5th grade Sunday school with his wife, Susan, before life in Washington just got a little too busy. What a story he has. And I think it's going to be, I actually think it's going to be better. And it wasn't my idea, so I'm not claiming any credit, but Troy and you, the idea of interviewing him, I think will actually be much more interesting. He'll give a good speech, but I don't think the speech is his best format. I think he does better when he's really talking from the heart about the issues he cares about. And Israel is one of them. The Arab world is one of them. Iran is certainly among them. And so how that all works together, we are seeing some of the biggest changes going on in the Middle East in the history of the region, certainly the modern history. And thank God we're not in a war right now, right? We've just come off of, 20 years ago in September will be the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And look at what's happened. Terrorism, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, genocide by ISIS against Christians and Yazidis in Syria and Iraq. If you think about the stories we've been talking about, and I've spoken at NRB conventions over the years talking about these horror shows, we're actually in a very interesting moment that's both encouraging and dangerous. And I can't think of anyone better than Secretary Pompeo to take us into that world. And I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to getting back to NRB.
Yeah, we're really excited about it. And again, we want to encourage folks to come to Texas to the NRB convention, June 21st through the 25th. And you can register at nrbconvention.org. Come and see Joel Rosenberg interview former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I want to follow up a little bit on some of the things you touched on there, particularly about the Abraham Accords. It's so interesting how that all unfolded, Joel, because so much of what happened seemed to defy conventional wisdom about the Middle East, right? That we had all kind of just accepted in terms of Israel's relationship with its Arab neighbors, in terms of, how to deal with Iran, in terms of the Israeli and Palestinian continuing conflict. And it just seemed like, there was a shift in the way the Trump administration had a strategic shift in the way it approached these things that it seemed initially was viewed by many as sort of naive or reckless,
right,
but ended up resulting in quite a bit of peace over there. So what do you make of that? And as you survey the Middle East, I know you have a book coming out in the fall about surveying the Middle East 20 years after 9/11. What do you make of the future of the Middle East in light of what's happened with the Abraham Accords?
Yeah. Well, Dan, again, you keep asking doctoral dissertation type questions. These like, you're right. I just wrote a book called Enemies and Allies. It'll be out in September. And it does look at the 20-year swath of change. And where are we now? It'll actually be the first book that deals with the Abraham Accords from the inside, because not just as a reporter or as a novelist, as an author, or somebody who lives here with two sons that have served in the Israeli army. Now, yeah, those are all interesting vantage points, but God opened up some extraordinary opportunities for me over the last several years to see this up close and personal. I had written a novel series a few years ago, Dan, that, for better for worse, but this political thriller was about the ISIS, jihadists trying to assassinate the actual king of Jordan, King Abdullah. I made him a named character in the book, and then ISIS is trying to kill him and his family, blow up his palace, and take over his country. Okay. And of course, just in the last few days, there's been a lot of talk about a possible coup attempt in Jordan. So, but anyway, that was fiction, okay? But the King Abdullah actually read one of the trilogy, one of the series in the trilogy, and rather than ban me from his kingdom forever, which he could have done, he invited me to come, me and my wife, to come for 5 days and to get to know him and his national security team, his inner circle. It was extraordinary. And that set into motion a series of evangelical delegations where he, but also other Arab leaders, invited me, Joel, would you bring 10, 12 evangelical leaders from the United States, from a kind of a cross section of different people, to come meet with us? And we're not trying to get you to be not, supportive of Israel. We think you should know what the changes are going on in our country. And of course, I was like, absolutely, because I want to advance peace. I want to advance religious freedom. I want to hear directly. I don't want to just read about these guys in the newspaper. I want to sit with them. And I haven't had an opportunity, Dan, over the last number of years to sit with almost all of the top leaders in the region, both in Israel, president, prime minister, defense minister, whatever, but also the crown princes, the kings, the presidents, the prime ministers of the Arab world. And so this book, Enemies and Allies, will take us into that world, but and from a front row seat, right? There's literally not a single book on the market right now where the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as he's often known as, who's the most controversial leader in the entire Arab world. Nobody has him on the record, but I've sat with him for hours and hours and hours, and you're not going to agree with everything he says. I don't agree with everything he says, but to be an evangelical sitting with him in the palace, I was told you're the first group of Christian leaders of any kind that have been invited to meet with the top leaders in Saudi Arabia in 300 years. So there's enormous change going on, and what I'm trying to do, and I'm very grateful that you guys are doing that and highlighting it, showcasing it at the NRB convention, is listen. Americans, especially American Christians, have had a lot of other things on their mind in 2020 and 21. You know, you had a pandemic, you had a massive controversial election, riots, unemployment, economic problems. It seemed apocalyptic, almost biblical, the number of plagues that have happened socially, culturally, physiologically. And I think that a lot of people, especially Christians, who do care about praying for the peace of Jerusalem, and they do care about the threats, who are our enemies in this part of the world, and who are our allies, but they haven't been paying attention mostly this year because there's just been too much else to think about. And the Middle East is, the first line of the book, Dan, is the old saying in Las Vegas is, what happens here stays here. Nobody ever says that about the Middle East. Okay, so that's the opening line, because you can ignore it, but the forces of the Middle East, for good or evil, will force you to focus on them once again. And so, it's a story that we need to understand. It affects our economy, our oil prices. It affects whether we send troops to the region. It affects our foreign policy. It affects our domestic lives. And for those of us who love Jesus, we care about Christians that are suffering in the Middle East, who are suffering in Iran, who are suffering in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Saudi Arabia. One of the things we brought up, I'll stop here because there's so much more to talk about, but there's not a single church that is legally allowed to operate in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, that's 32 million people. And one of the things I've brought up when we've had these conversations, and my evangelical colleagues and I have said, listen, in the United Arab Emirates, there's more than 700 operating churches. We were just there. We just met with the Crown Prince there, and it's very exciting. It's not that everything is perfect for Christians in the UAE, but there's an Arab country on the Arabian Gulf where you can freely meet and you can freely open a church. That's not the case in Saudi Arabia. Why not? Can we move forward? So advocacy, we want to listen. We want to learn from these type of leaders, but we're also trying to make a case that to improve the lives and the religious freedom of Christians, of Jews, and of course, advance peace and so forth. So I'm trying to get my head around it, and I'm asking the Lord, show me how to communicate it to evangelicals in the United States and Canada, but also all over the world who do care and are going to start refocusing and saying, why is that? What do we need to know? Yeah,
that's really good. And I want to encourage folks, we probably will have a little bit of time for questions here with Joel Rosenberg. So if you have a question, maybe put that in the chat box here in Zoom. We have quite a few folks who've joined us today, and I'm grateful for all of you who have joined this NRB Live at Lunch with Joel Rosenberg. If you've missed our previous ones that we've had on a range of topics, you can go to our YouTube page or Facebook page and find them there. And again, I want to encourage you to go to nrbconvention.org and register for the convention in Texas, June 21st through the 25th. Joel, I want you to expand a little bit on something you said. There's a couple things you said that I want you to expand upon. It seems like there is a kind of, at least a little bit of openness in some of these Arab governments in terms of their attitude, obviously their attitudes toward Israel in terms of recognizing Israel's right to exist.
Oh, this is breathtaking. This is
insane stuff.
Movement.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And saying stuff about Israel that is positively, that is shocking, that I've never, we've never seen in our lifetime, which is really, it's interesting how little coverage it's gotten compared to how significant it is. But does it also seem there's a bit more openness toward Christians in these regions? Are you finding a little bit of that, at least in some of the ones that have made peace with Israel? So maybe talk about why there's more different attitudes about Israel and maybe more openness toward Christians. Is this a generational thing? Is this just a strategic thing because of mutual, worry about Iran? What kind of goes into some of this?
Dan, there's a range of factors that are converging into what we would usually call a perfect storm. That's usually something bad. In this case, it's converging into something very, very positive. But it's a series of threads that are or roads that are leading to one place. One of them is I would say the central theme is the Iran threat. Okay, the Iran threat is so serious. Iran is moving steadily towards building not just one nuclear weapon, but an entire arsenal. And the missiles can already reach every country in the Middle East. They can reach Europe, and soon, if they're not stopped, they'll be able to reach the United States, the homeland. That threat and the fact that the Obama-Biden administration decided to cut a deal with Iran that the leaders in the region thought was so dangerous. Okay? And I'm not trying to make a partisan point at the moment. I'm making an analytical point. I mean, I do feel strongly about it, but it's an analytical point. I've sat with Arab leaders at the highest levels who said, we felt betrayed. How dare you go open secret negotiations with our worst enemy who will hit us first when you're half a world away and you're supposed to be our ally? What is happening? Now you're giving them $150 billion? Like, don't you know that money's going to go to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Hamas? I joke, Dan, that every terror organization that's connected to Iran has to start with the letter H, at least in English. But so they felt scared. Israel felt that way too. And as Arab countries thought, well, if we have to go to war with Iran, is the United States going to be there for us? And they were thinking, I don't think they're going to be. Well, who would be? And they thought, well, those Israelis, they are more worried about Iran than anybody, and they have the strongest military in the region. Maybe they're not the problem. Maybe Israel's part of the answer. But then that made them think, well, okay, but we've had this, 100-year support of the Palestinians. And they began to assess it. And I know this because these leaders have told me directly. So it's not like I'm hearing it third or fifth hand,
right,
whatever. And they'll say things like, look, we still support the Palestinian people. We want them to have a better life, as do I, by the way, me, Joel Rosenberg, both as a Christian, as a Jew, as an Israeli, as an American, as a Jerusalem resident who lives here, who owns a home here. Like, they're my neighbors. I'm commanded to love them, but I also want to. But the Arab leaders who've shipped in billions of dollars worth of aid and all kinds of political support and so forth, they're kind of assessing, what have we gotten for our investment? Palestinian leadership, not the people, but the leadership says no to like almost every possible peace deal there has ever been. And yet, why? Like, okay, like they're not going to get everything they want, but nobody gets everything they want. So there's a lot of rethinking going on, and the Iran threat is driving it. Now, there's other things. You mentioned generational. Yes, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, told us directly. He said, listen, I'm 35 years old. I think he's 37 now, but at the time we met him first, I'm 35. He goes, 70% of my country is younger than me. They don't remember 1948. They don't remember 56. They don't remember 67. They don't remember 73. They don't remember 82. They don't remember 87. They don't remember 1990. I mean, that's just a few of the wars that we've had in this region. Like, wow, it's the gift that keeps on giving, unfortunately, the wars between Israel and the Arab people. But the point is, he says, yeah, they've read about it in the book, but it's not personal to them. Now, the 30% that do remember, This is the challenge. This is the academic class. This is the business class. This is the clerical class. This is the government class, the deep state, if you want to use it. But the point is, that's the establishment. And they have a problem with Israel. They've been taught that, and they actually have it. The 70%, not so much. So there's an opportunity that's changing, okay? Now, the Saudis were a closed kingdom, a forbidden kingdom, and they didn't care. They had money, they had oil, so they had money, and they had Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in the most sacred sites in Islam. So they could just say, we don't want outsiders. But the Gulf states, like the United Arab Emirates, like Bahrain, Oman, these are countries that are like, listen, we're small. We have oil, but we have to be trading with people from all over the world. We need to be more open to their cultures. We have our own views, but we have to be welcoming. The Saudis didn't have to be welcoming. But what's happened? The United Arab Emirates has created like the most interesting, multifaceted, tolerant society in the entire Arab world. And it's wealthy and it's successful. And you walk around there as a Jew, as an evangelical, you feel safe. You've got churches, you've got mosques, you've got Hindu temples, Buddhists, and I think what's happening is MBS is watching the UAE as just one of the models, Bahrain's another, and saying, I want to become like that. Now, he's not going to say that on the record, that part, right? But there's a lot of change. But here's the main thing. The Saudis are running out of oil, okay? They know it. And the world is shifting from oil to cleaner, greener technologies. The United States now produces more oil than Saudi Arabia. So the world is not becoming dependent on Saudi Arabia. That day is coming to an end. So what do they need? They need to change their entire economy. And to do it, they need foreign direct investment, they need trade, they need high technology, and they need tourists. Now, how are you going to get all those things to come to Saudi Arabia, the Forbidden Kingdom? By changing. By saying, you know what? I know we were forbidden. I know we were intolerant. I know you think of us as a lot of ways. We want to change, and we are changing. That's again the short version. But there are major changes in attitude and outlook. Now, I'm not saying it's not reversible. Okay. Remember, Turkey was once the seat of the Caliphate, the Islamic kingdom, for 600 years or so. Then they lost World War I to the British, the Americans, and they changed from a very dangerous Islamic society to a much more free and open Turkish society that was pro-Western, part of NATO, tolerant, economically growing. That was one change, but now they're changing back. Now they have a new leader that I describe in the book, Recep Erdogan, who wants to take the country in the exact opposite direction, a dark place, a radical Islamist country. So even when there's change, you can't assume that change will be there forever. Iran was once an ally of Israel until 1979. And then the Ayatollah Khomeini came in, and then all bets were off. So these are the type of changes that are going on. Last point for Christians. Look, we gotta keep respectfully but firmly pushing the Saudis. You gotta release human rights prisoners. You just can't hold these people forever. No, it's wrong. It's wrong. You need to allow churches to open. We're not asking for democracy. We're just asking for more religious freedom and cultural freedom, because ultimately you will not convince the world that you are really changing if you tell 2.2 billion Christians around the world, I'm sorry, we can worship in your country, we can worship Islam, we can read the Quran, but when you come to our country, forget it. There are actually 1.4 million Christian foreign workers who live and work in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 1.4 million. They don't have a single church. To say nothing of Muslims in Saudi Arabia who've left Islam and come to faith in Jesus, a very sensitive issue there. But that's happening too, maybe 100,000 or more.
That's amazing.
So we've got to pray, but we also have to push a little. And That's a little bit of what I'm up to.
So it does seem like there's a lot of opportunity here for, as you know, NRB is international in scope, and there's a lot of our ministries that are broadcasting the gospel. A lot of them are on the ground in these areas, whether they're doing evangelism work, but a lot of relief work and all kinds of things. So it seems like there's a lot of opportunity, in the places where we felt perhaps there wasn't an open door there. We've got
plus, let's just underscore the most important NRB connection to all this. The primary way for people in the Muslim world to at least hear the gospel of Jesus Christ and at least consider, who was Jesus the Messiah? Does that also mean you're the Son of God? Does it also mean you're the only way of salvation? Is it true or isn't it? And then what am I going to do about it? Primarily, the way a Muslim's going to hear that is through communications like satellite television, radio, the internet, because you can't just rent a big stadium and invite, obviously not Billy Graham anymore, but Franklin Graham or Greg Laurie or whatever. You can't. It's illegal. You'll be killed. So media has this beautiful way in God's design to go right over the heads of the mullahs and the governments and go into people's homes and therefore their hearts to at least weigh it. We're not trying to force anybody to become a follower of Jesus, but how can they believe if they haven't even heard?
Right.
And how can they hear unless somebody tells them? And how can they tell them unless there's the freedom and the technology and the networks to do it? And that's what NRB defends and helps strengthen. And that's one of the reasons I'm so grateful for NRB.
Well, we appreciate that. And one of the topics we'll be talking about also with Secretary Pompeo is his just incredibly great work on religious freedom overseas with the ministeriums he did and just putting a huge emphasis on that work. We've got some questions from folks. And so Cynthia asks a great question about persecution of Christians in Muslim countries. She says, I'm a Pakistani Christian and I now live in Michigan. It's heartbreaking that Christians are being persecuted in Pakistan. We feel helpless about this. We talked a little bit about this already, but what are you seeing in terms of those things? It seems like some countries are going backward and more repressive of Christians, and some are opening up.
So the persecution of followers of Jesus Christ is as bad in the Muslim world as it would be anywhere on the planet. Certainly China and North Korea are right up there, but the Muslim world as well. But some countries are certainly getting better, and when they are getting better, they deserve credit. We should give honor to where honor is due, but that doesn't mean we're giving a blank check and we're not, like if it's the Saudis or the Emiratis or whomever, good, but we want to see more, right? I mean, these are our brothers and sisters, and we're not going to remain silent. And and this is a big topic that we talk about on All Israel News, all Arab News as well, our sister site. The persecution is very serious, but there's a counterintuitive point that I want to make here, and that is this. One of the things that intrigues me is I've traveled from Morocco in the west to Afghanistan in the east. I've traveled through most, not all of these countries. Some of them, maybe I could get in, but I don't think I could get out with the name Rosenberg and the whole thing. Certainly not with Israeli citizenship. But the countries that are the most radicalized and the most dangerous for Christians, if you look at that, take the Open Doors annual report, let's say, and you go, all right, what are the most difficult, dangerous countries for Christians in the Middle East? Okay. Or anywhere. But then overlay, where are we seeing the most fruit? Where are people leaving Islam or communism in China and coming to faith in Jesus Christ? It's the most dangerous and difficult countries. So this is one of the interesting things, because like in Iran, and I believe on here, I just saw when we were just coming on, I think my dear friend Hormoz Sharia is actually joining us right now just to listen. But Hormoz is the Billy Graham of Iran. Okay, I've known him for, 10 plus years. He recently came out with a wonderful book about Iran's Great Awakening. More than 1 million Shia Muslims have left Islam and come to faith in Jesus Christ since 1979. And he's one of them. In 1979, Hormoz Shariat was on the streets of Tehran with millions of people chanting death to America, death to Israel. Then a few months later, he and his wife thought, well, maybe not death to America quite yet. We'd like to go to graduate school over there. And it was there. I was going to say here because I'm American originally. It was in Southern California where he and his wife came to faith in Jesus Christ. People loved him. They prayed for him. They shared the gospel with him. They read the Bible. They got it. They believed. And now he runs a 24-hour day, 7-day a week, 365 a year television network broadcasting the gospel into Iran. It's an amazing book. I wrote the foreword, but I don't get any royalties, but I'm super supportive of this book and of him. Why do I say it? Because if you were interviewing Hormoz on this, and I would encourage you to do that on a future webinar lunch, he will tell you what he tells me, which is Iran, it's because of the radicalism, even the apocalyptic nature of the regime, that's causing Muslims in Iran to go, well, if this is pure Islam, if that's the way it's supposed to be practiced, I'm out. Now, they can't go anywhere, so they have to look. It's called, my friend Natan Sharansky, who used to live in this, was trapped in the Soviet Union and Gulag for 9 years. He calls it double think or double speak. You basically, on the outside, when you're walking around the town, the village, the city, you act like a devout Muslim because you don't want anyone to know. But when you get in your home, maybe in your own private room or closet, that's where you come to faith in Jesus, and you're trying to figure out when and how do I make that public? How do I live for Jesus? But Hormoz's point, and that's just Iran, but I think it applies. We know there's many people in Pakistan coming to faith, and in other countries too. Saudi Arabia is one of them, but Afghanistan to a degree. Sudan, more than 5 million people have come to Christ. They had genocide and jihad there. Now they just made peace with Israel. So from a geopolitical perspective, okay, from the Mike Pompeo with his State Department cap on, what do we want as Americans? We want moderate countries in the Muslim world. We want peaceful countries, pro-Western countries. That's true for American foreign policy. But as Christians, we also have to remember that the countries that are the most moderate, Morocco, Jordan, Turkey, until it's changing now, but that's where we're seeing the least amount of Muslims leave Islam and come to faith in Jesus. So there's two different things that are true, and we have to just ask the Lord to show us how can we strengthen our brothers and sisters, both by prayer, but whatever practical support we can have, and especially being their voice. They are mostly voiceless. And so if we can talk to top leaders or other Christians or something like this, we need to be the voice for the voiceless. They don't have an opportunity to go on, social media and talk openly. This is something that we do, and NRB defends our right to do it.
That's really good. We have a few more minutes for, I want to get to
a couple shorter answers.
A couple of these questions here. No, that was fantastic. And it's really, I think, good for us to hear that what God is doing over in the Middle East to bring people to Jesus. We tend to get jaded. We read headlines. We think none of that can happen in this generation. It's really exciting for us. Okay, here's a question that we haven't covered before, but is very important, I think. George asks, how significant is the refugee crisis in the Middle East? And how is that going to impact some of these geopolitical things?
The refugee crisis in the Middle East is horrific. If you just take Syria alone, Syria is a country of, at its peak, 28 million people. And at least a third of those have either fled or been killed or been internally displaced. The percentage actually may be higher than that. Where do they go? They go to Lebanon. They go to Jordan. They went to Iraq for a while. They go to Turkey. They go to Europe. Some came to the United States. But, that was in the news for a long time. And now it's not. But those people are still in a ruined country or living in a tent in the next door neighbor country. Like, it's terrible. The Joshua Fund, which is the nonprofit ministry that my wife and I started 15 years ago almost, because I was writing all these political thrillers about all the terrible things that could happen in the Middle East. And people were like, okay, those are interesting books, Joel, but there's terrible things happening in the Middle East. What can we do? How can we help? And the Joshua Fund works in Israel, the Palestinian territories, and in 5 neighboring Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, the hotspots. And we've invested more than $50 million over the years to strengthen the churches, to provide humanitarian relief to Iraqi refugees, to Syrian refugees, to Holocaust survivors in Israel, to widows, to orphans, victims of war and terror. Look, $50 million may sound like a lot, but it's a drop in the bucket. The point is, we do it through the local believers. There's no reason to have a Joshua Fund brand in these countries. It's certainly not connected to me, Jewish, Israeli, the whole thing. It doesn't help. But to be able to provide, to invest in the ministries on the ground, local believers know the language, they know the culture, they know how to be the hands and feet of Jesus. But they need prayer, but honestly, they need more than that. They need resources. And for Americans and other Christians around the world, the question is, how would I know whom to trust to give to, right? You can say, I want to help the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. But Lebanon's controlled by an Iranian terror proxy named Hezbollah. Like, how do I know the money gets there? Well, that's what the Joshua Fund does. We're like a mutual fund, and our team of pastors and others, we go and we spend time and we vet these folks and encourage them and love them and pray for them. But we also then say, okay, here's our list of our limited resources, but this is where we know if we give, these are real believers, they're really doing the work, they're doing it with unconditional love, the money really gets there. And that's the Joshua Fund, trying to be a trusted resource for people who have hearts of compassion. But it's always possible to send your $25 to the website that looks like they're doing great work, and then you're like, you don't really ever know, did that make a difference? But we try to make the Joshua Fund be a place that you can trust.
That's good. And that answers another question that has come up here. He just, actually, she asks, what practical steps can we as prayer warriors and business people take to further the gospel in the Middle East? And I would recommend the Joshua Fund as a vehicle for that. And of course, there's other, NRB members that are doing some really good work, Samaritan's Purse and some others. But I guess that would be your recommendation, right?
It would. And I think there's really 2 nonprofits that I've founded in my life to deal with 2 specific problems. The one problem, as I just described, is I care about the gospel, I care about the Bible, I care about people who are suffering, I care about the church in the Middle East. How do I help? That's the Joshua Fund. But there's the other part, which goes back to NRB, which is the media war, like the bias, like, where do I find credible information about what's going on in the region? How do I trust that those stories are true and it's not fake news? Where do I find information and analysis that has a biblical evangelical worldview? That's why last year I decided to start a new nonprofit to create All Israel News and All Arab News, because I didn't want to just get angry about these things, Dan. Like, you can just howl into the wind, or you can go start something and say,
and build something. Yeah.
And we prayed about it. We felt this is what we should do. So that's the other thing, is how do people know about these things? To me, it's integrated. My novels have given me a platform to meet people like you. The websites, All Israel News, All Arab News, give me a platform to explain, and not just me, Israeli journalists, Palestinians, Lebanese, Americans, working together in peace, in Christ, to explain this and to help people understand. And then the Joshua Fund, very specifically targeted with investment. And for me, in my life, yes, it's a very busy day every day, but that helps me cover the things I care about, which is sharing the gospel, being a watchman on the wall to explain what are the threats coming to America, to Israel, to others, to the church, explaining that through novels and nonfiction books and articles, but also making a practical difference. And I think both of those, both Joshua Fund and our All Israel News site, those would be places to invest that honestly are woefully underfunded when you look at the magnitude of the media bias challenge and the need to strengthen the local church that's struggling and sometimes even suffering seriously in this part of the world.
So we've got about 3 minutes. I've got 2 more questions I want to ask. Do you have time to do this? I want to be
we'll do lightning round. Sure.
A good steward of your time. I've saved this question because I think it's a great one. Richanda asks, would the Rosenbergs have a cat? Because I think I see a cat bed. That's the first part of it.
And sometimes I get frustrated with the cat and I call her Yasser Era cat, but that's because she's usually meowing furiously right in the middle of a Zoom interview. So yes, so I will let her in very nicely in a few minutes.
And then she says, in all seriousness, what are you reading these days? Or is there anything you want to recommend? Besides, I want to just give another plug for your novel that's out right now, The Beirut Protocol, which is a thriller. If you've never read a Joel Rosenberg thriller, you need to read one.
There you go.
Make this the day you do that. And it's just, you won't be able to put the book down. You'll enjoy it and you'll learn a lot too. Is there anything you're reading these days outside of that stuff that's interesting to you?
Well, I'm not reading it right now because I read it and I endorsed it. But again, I would put another plug in for my friend Dr. Hormoz Shariat. And I think it's called Iran's Great Awakening. We did an interview with him for All Israel News. But you can Google it. It's on Amazon. Amazing story. From an inside, the guy was a Shia Muslim in Iran. And then he came to faith in Jesus. That story alone is awesome. We say in Hebrew, Dayenu. This alone would be enough. But how God used he and his family and his team to take the gospel. He's the Billy Graham of Iran. You got to read this book. It's a must-read book. In fact, skip mine. You can get back to it later. Read Hormoz's first.
Okay, then last question. Of course, we saved the easy ones for last, right? It says it looks like Biden will go back to the JCPOA. How will that impact Israel? And then do you foresee Israel attacking nuclear sites in Iran? The first part of that question is, it seems like there's a little bit of wanting on the part of President Biden to want to go back to JCPOA, but it doesn't look like there's even a pathway back, even if he wanted to, right? Because it's hard. I mean, can you put the toothpaste back in the tube once you've got all these peace agreements and you got the Abraham Accords and all that? Just maybe.
Well, okay. The short version is President Biden absolutely wants to go back into the Iran nuclear deal. He wants to, in part, because he was the vice president under the president who negotiated the original deal, and he feels like it was the right thing to do. I don't question his sincerity, but I question his judgment because it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. Iran is becoming more aggressive over the last 5 or 6 years, not less. So that's one thing. Iran is super close to building nuclear weapons. Like, they're closer now than they were. Okay. Now, Iran is suffering from these economic sanctions that Trump put in place. They're really suffering. That's why they want a deal. But what Biden needs to do, I'm not opposed to a deal in principle. I'm opposed to a bad deal. Okay. And so what Biden needs to do is take all the leverage that Trump and Pence and Pompeo created, the maximum pressure campaign, and recognize that, yes, the mullahs and the ayatollahs in Tehran, they're desperate for a deal. Don't look more desperate than them. Make them come and give up. You can sell all the oil and have all the trade you want as long as you don't keep building nuclear weapons capacity. Right. It's not a difficult proposition. No American wants to go invade Iran. We're not going to go do another Iraq, regime change. Iran is all set to be at least free of the sanctions. Hopefully, my prayer is that they're, eventually the regime is toppled. But we're not going to go invade them. But Biden can't be more desperate than the mullahs. Okay, it just otherwise the Biden team was going to get taken they're going to have their lunch taken from them. Last point, you asked about the questioner asked about war. Listen, Israel is feeling very scared right now. We're trying to be nice to Biden. He's a nice man. He loves Israel. He's much warmer with our leaders than President Obama was. It's true. But this road he's going on is the wrong road. And it's not just with Iran. It's with all of Iran's proxy force, a terror proxy. So Israel is getting dangerously close to thinking, well, if Biden blows this in various ways and Iran keeps moving towards the bomb, we have no choice. We cannot afford a second Holocaust. You know, an Iranian nuclear missile, one of them, could accomplish in 6 minutes what it took Adolf Hitler 6 years to do, and that is to kill 6 million Jews. Okay? We have 6.5 million Jews in this country. One nuclear weapon in the center of the country will kill the entire country. So we don't have the luxury to be half a world away and go, well, you know, let's try to figure it out. No. So Israel might feel forced in the coming months, year. I don't know the timing, and I'm praying that, you know, we don't have to do it. But if we go to war, then what happens? The reason I wrote the Beirut Protocol. This book is about Iran's number one way to retaliate if Israel does a first strike is to take their Hezbollah terror force in Lebanon and order them to fire the 150,000 missiles that they have positioned in Lebanon against Israel. This is a nightmare scenario. This is what I wrote about in the Beirut Protocol, but that's fiction. I don't want it to come true, but we are heading down an unbelievably dangerous road. And that's why, just to wrap up, this is what we're covering every day, these type of stories on All Israel News, All Arab News. But it's also why I've got the book coming out in the fall, Enemies and Allies. I deal with the enemies. I interviewed Pompeo for this, Pence, Trump, and all these Arab leaders. I interviewed the defense minister of Israel, exclusive interviews. You are not going to see anywhere else. Tell our readers what's going on. What do we need to fear? But at the same time, tell us, but this could be done differently. Something's changing, something positive. And then the last section, how should Christians look at all of this? What's our unique angle on it? And anyway, that's what I do. And honestly, I don't know how to do anything else. So this is why I focus on learning and explaining to people what's happening in this part of the world.
Well, this has been a great time. NRB Live at Lunch. So much good information here, and really a great update on what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Israel. And we're grateful for you, Joel, and the work that you're doing. We're pumped to have you,
Thank you.
June 21st to the 25th at the NRB convention. And want to tell everyone that is on here that you can go register nrbconvention.org, be interviewing former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I want to encourage folks to check out Joel's books, the Beirut Protocol, which is out right now, and then